Hi, this is Jeffrey Stern. Welcome back to the Madlik podcast. Madlik means to light, to kindle, to ignite. And today, as always, we'll try to shed a little bit of a light on a Jewish tradition or a text. I'm podcasting at the end of Rosh Hashanah, and you might think the last thing we want is another Devar Torah or drasha, let alone a holiday, let alone a fast. But tomorrow morning, as the sun rises, there is a minor fast called the Fast of Gedalia, and today we're going to try to shed a little bit of light onto this minor fast, which might arguably have a major message for us that's as timely today as it's ever been. I'm podcasting from Portland, Oregon, where I've spent a wonderful Rosh Hashanah with my daughter. We davened at a wonderful conservative synagogue called Sha'arei Torah, and if you're ever in Portland, it's walking distance from the Pearl area. I highly recommend you pay them a visit. So sit back, fasten your seatbelts, and get set to learn a little bit about an innocuous figure in Jewish history. So when's the Messiah gonna come? Well, most of you have probably heard that if the Jews keep 2 Shabbatot, 2 Sabbaths in a row, that'll bring the Messiah. You might have also heard that the Messiah will come when a generation is either totally pure or totally guilty. Ein Ben-David ba ela b'dor shekoulo zachai o koulo Chayav. That's in Sanhedrin. Well, most of you have listened to these 2 predictions and thought, well, they're pretty harmless. If you keep 2 Shabbatot, what's to be lost? Wouldn't do anybody any harm. And in terms of a generation being totally good or totally bad, so be it. But that's because you probably think of this last Talmudic statement as a descriptive statement. What happens if it's not just descriptive? What happens if it's prescriptive? In other words, what happens if it tells you by way of directions that you can bring the Messiah, if you will, force the hand of God, by either creating a society that is totally good or totally bad? Well, here again, if it's totally good, that kind of dovetails into the first prediction that we read, which is that if the Jews would keep 2 Shabbatot, they'd have a much better sense of the beauty, of the sublimity, of the unplugged nature of Shabbat, and maybe we could make the world a better place. But if you look at it from the other perspective, what about a world that's totally bad? What happens if that statement becomes not descriptive, but prescriptive? In a sense, that means that in order to force the hand of God to bring the Messiah, we're not talking about Torah tanks going out and trying to get every Jew to keep the mitzvot, put on tefillin or shakel or lulav or an esrog. We're talking about trying to make the world worse, or to create some sort of cataclysm, some sort of radically disruptive event that will be so bad that the only avenue out would be for the Deus ex machina, for God's hand to come and to redeem us all. And that ultimately is what happened with our friend Gedalia. We're going back now to the first temple. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. And as we know, most of the Jews were exiled to Babylonia. But early on, there was one group of Jews that were not exiled. They were rather transferred to a Jewish community, a new Jewish community. But rather they were transferred by Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon to an area called Yehud province, which I guess would be considered today as maybe the first ghetto. And Nebuchadnezzar too actually appointed a Jewish governor, and his name was Gedalia. We don't know anything about him really, except that because of what happened to him, we have a fast day, the day after Rosh Hashanah. And what did happen to him was he was not killed on the day after Rosh Hashanah. He was actually assassinated by a bunch of zealots on Rosh Hashanah. And the zealots were so incensed by the fact that this governor, this Jewish governor, stood between total cataclysm, total apocryphal, end-of-world catastrophe, that in a sense this governor, being kind of a compromise to reality, an adaptation to a terrible situation, precluding the possibility that this cataclysm, that this catastrophe would have a sense of finality that would be ultimate and would force the hand of God and bring the redemption. So it's bad enough that this happened, but the good news is that our tradition ultimately realized how poisonous, how potentially damaging this type of approach was. And even though we have 10 days, call it even a month, chock full of one Jewish holiday, one Jewish commemoration after another, they felt it was important enough to schedule still another minor fast day the day after Rosh Hashanah. And putting it the day after Rosh Hashanah, they also showed how drastic the zealots were in actually not only taking a human life and thereby doing the ultimate grievance between one man and another, but they did it on the holy day of the Lord, and in a sense, they were breaking the laws of the Torah as well. So the backstory of all this is this tradition, whether we like it or not, that is robust within Judaism, and more specifically within Messianism, for an apocalyptic event which is necessary to bring the Messiah. And today what I'd like to do, in the spirit of learning from the assassination of Gedalia, I'd like to flush out a little bit what apocalyptic Jewish Messianism looks like, and make the argument, along with Gershom Scholem, that in fact it's not a minor current within Jewish Messianism. It's not something that did not arise with the beginning and in a sense is retained within the whole total scheme of Messianism, but in fact it's part and parcel of the Messianic idea. So for our first source, and this is source number 2, I'd like you to take a look at Gershom Scholem's The Messianic Idea in Judaism. If you have the text, it's pages 10, and it goes on for about 7 pages because it's that important. But what Gershom Scholem starts out to prove is that the catastrophic, this sense of vision of doom that is necessary to bring the Messiah, similar to what we just saw and experienced with these zealots, is applied to both the transition and the destruction in which the Messianic redemption is born. And therefore we have something, again, which is not minor, but a major theme within Messianism, which is this sense of the Chevlei Mashiach, Xavlo shel Mashiach, which is the birth pangs of the Messiah. So the Messianists and the Messianic tradition within our tradition takes the metaphor of a woman giving birth, this sense of pain and agony and rupture associated with giving birth, as necessary and a sign of and a prescription for having the Messiah come. We need those same type of birth pangs. this sense of apocalyptic, catastrophic events is also applied to the terrors of the Last Judgment. In other words, when we read our prayers, we modern Westerners think of the Messianic ideal as the lion lying down with the lamb. But we kind of skim over all of those prayers that are really talking about retribution, revenge, settling scores. So the catastrophic character of the redemption in Scholem's mind is essential to the apocalyptic concept. Scholem goes on to say it finds manifold expression in world wars and revolutions, in epidemics, famine, and economic catastrophe, and in an equal degree in apostasy and the desecration of God's name. And I would argue that in the assassination of Gedalia, we have both. We have these zealots trying to create or trying to ensure that this catastrophe that happened was complete, so that there were no Jews living in the land of Israel, and therefore the destruction of the temple, the destruction of the Second Commonwealth were complete. The end was upon us. And also, it had this element of apostasy and the desecration of God's name, believe it or not. And that would explain why it possibly was done on Rosh Hashanah. In any case, the tractate of Sanhedrin, which deals with all of these predictions and I would argue prescriptions for the Messianic age, is full of these extravagant formulations. And all of them drive towards this concept of the world will have to be either all good or all evil in order to create what ultimately is this disruptive event with a capital D. Scholem even goes so far as to say that it's no surprise, therefore, that three famous teachers in the 3rd and 4th centuries exclaimed about the Messiah, "May he come, but I don't want to see him." It's almost as though the rabbis understood how disruptive, how full of violence and bestiality, and ultimately that which is probably the most primitive within us will have to occur in order to change the nature of the world and bring in this apocalyptic age. Now, Scholem goes on to argue that there have been those Jewish historians and commentators going back to the Middle Ages who have tried to suppress this part of the Messianic narrative. But he argues that, in fact, it's part and parcel of it. Scholem argues that these elements of dread and consolation are intertwined. Dread and peril of the end form an element of shock and of the shocking, which induces extravagance, writes Scholem. The terrors of the real historical experiences of the Jewish people are joined with images drawn from the heritage of myth or mythical fantasy. This is expressed with particular forcefulness in the concept of the birth pangs of the Messiah, which in this case means the Messianic age. The paradoxical nature of this conception exists in the fact that the redemption which is born here is in no causal sense a result of previous history. Let me repeat that, because now Scholem is making a very important point about the disruption and the distinction between natural history, natural processes, and this vision of an apocalypse. He says, the fact that the redemption which is born here is in no causal sense a result of previous history. It is precisely the lack of transition between history and the redemption which is always stressed by the prophets and the apocalypse. The Bible and the apocalyptic writers know of no progress in history leading to the redemption. The redemption is not the product of imminent developments such as we find in modern Western interpretations of Messianism since the Enlightenment were. secularized as the belief in progress. Messianism still displayed unbroken and immense vigor. It is rather transcendence breaking in upon history, an intrusion in which history itself perishes, transformed its ruin because it is struck by a beam of light shining into it from an outside source. The constructions of history in which the apocalypse, as opposed to the prophets of the Bible, revel, have nothing to do with modern conceptions of development or progress. So that's the real point that I want to make here. If there is a recognition of the zealots, we have to understand that the position of these zealots who killed Gedalia was, number one, not unique. It was part and parcel of the Messianic apocalyptic vision. And in fact, if today we look at Messianism as something much more benign, and we focus on the end result of the beatific coexistence of different forces in nature and the unification of that which is divided, that's good and fine, but you can't separate that, argues Scholem, and I argue, from the destructive, disruptive, cataclysmic type of things that need to happen, and in the case of zealots, things that they need to make happen. So we've seen where this occurred with Gedalia. There's another very well-known event in Jewish history where something similar to this happened as well, although unlike Gedalia, because there was no assassination, there doesn't seem to be a particular celebration or remembrance for the event. But I'm talking in the year 70 CE, when Jerusalem is under siege. And it's a story that many of you have heard, where the zealots in charge of Jerusalem are not permitting any food to get in, any water to get in. There's starvation. Following along the kind of gestalt that we've been exploring, we can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the siege of Jerusalem and the situation bringing it to its extreme. So for them, starvation and loss of life is not something to be prevented. It's something almost to be welcomed. It reminds me of what Thomas Friedman said about mutual assured destruction, MAD, the philosophy and strategy that operated during the Cold War with the Soviet Unions, based on the assumption that if you had enough of a nuclear stockpile to ensure that even if the other side fired, you could launch enough missiles to destroy the other side as well, as long as there was mutual assured destruction, that would prevent any nuclear attack. And what Thomas Friedman said is you can't really apply that to the Iranians and other cultures which have an apocalyptic vision for the future, because mutual assured destruction, in the words of Friedman, is not a deterrence, it's an invitation to the party. So getting back to the zealots, the Jewish militants, they were called Biryonim. They created a siege, not only not permitting anything into Jerusalem, but not permitting anything or anyone to leave Jerusalem. And the famous story goes that Yochanan ben Zakkai is smuggled out by his students by letting it be known that the great sage had died. The students put him into a coffin as they are leaving the city. So the Biryonim, these radical guards, wanted to plunge their swords into the coffin, and the students thought very quickly, and they said, if you do that, the Romans are going to say we have no respect for our elders. So fast forward, Yochanan ben Zakkai gets out. He meets with Vespasian. the governor. He impresses Vespasian, and the governor Vespasian says to him, whatever you want, I will give you. And he asks for three things, but the most famous thing he asks for is, he says, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha, give me Yavne, which was the rabbinic academy, and its scholars. And the criticism of Yochanan ben Zakkai obviously was that he didn't ask for enough. And the Talmud says that Rabbi Yosef, and some say Rabbi Akiva, comment that sometimes God makes the wise foolish. For Ben Zakkai should have requested the preservation of Jerusalem and the Holy Temple, and then the Jewish people would have been given a second chance. So two things to point out here. Number one, the zealots, the militants, who I would call the Messianists, would prefer not to have a plan B, not to ameliorate the situation, cut their losses and move on. They were looking for total cataclysmic destruction. That's one point to take out of the story. And I should say that because of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is considered a hero of the Talmud and of the rabbis, rabbinic Judaism was unable to survive. And in a sense, because rabbinic Judaism was the vehicle for Judaism outside of the land of Israel for close to 2,000 years, Yochanan ben Zakkai can be considered he who ultimately saved Judaism to fight another day and to ultimately come back to the land of Israel and to reconfigure itself. The other point that I wanted to make is the criticism of Yochanan ben Zakkai by Rabbi Yosef and maybe even Rabbi Akiva, where they called him foolish. They called Yochanan ben Zakkai naive. And that seems to be the biggest criticism of those thinkers, whether they're the Gedalias of the world who we really know nothing about and for all we know was simply a puppet or a pawn, or the great thinkers like Yochanan ben Zakkai, who did the hard work of strategizing and understanding what was to be lost, what was to be gained, a cost-benefit analysis, if you will, and come up with a strategy or a plan that would enable the Jewish people to survive, as opposed to the militants who in fact would welcome with open arms a catastrophe, or others such as Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Akiva, who would second guess, but ultimately did not have any basis for believing that an alternative was possible. So the rabbis of the Talmud defend Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, saying that if he had asked for too much, he would have gotten nothing, and that ultimately it gives him credit for preserving the Jewish people for the 2,000-year dislocation. But that brings me to modern times, because we seem to have today, in contemporary Jewish thought, and certainly in Israeli political thought, come to the conclusion that any sort of adoption to the reality, conflict resolution, the incremental change of opinions that is necessary when one does long-term negotiations or tries to bring two parties, in this case two nations, whether it's the Palestinians and the Israelis or in other conflicts such as that, to resolution, that we have a problem with this sense of concession or this sense of adaptation to reality is one simple word, and the word is appeasement. If you go to Wikipedia and you look up the word appeasement, it says, in a political context, it's a diplomatic policy of making political or material concessions to an enemy power in order to avoid conflict. The term is most often applied to the foreign policy of the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, Stanley Baldwin, and Neville Chamberlain towards Nazi Germany. So once that happened, any time you have a political leader who is trying to make an accommodation, who is trying to do the hard work of gradual change, the tag of appeasement is leveled upon him or her, and all of a sudden we're talking Nazi Germany, and we're talking Hitler, and we're talking making concessions to the devil. And I would argue that it's much more sophisticated than that, it's much more nuanced than that, and that we have to pull ourselves out of tagging anything that sounds like a compromise as something negative in terms of appeasing evil. And I would argue that the lesson of Tzom Gedalia, of the fast of Gedalia, is exactly that, cannot come at a more important time and influential time. The holy day of Rosh Hashanah and the holy day of Yom Kippur, right smack in the middle, we have the Tzom Gedalia, which talks about you want change, you want tshuva, you want things to be better, make sure you go about it in the proper way, which is the way of doing the hard work and many times the compromise necessary to make that change. And do not fall for this very dark, evil, and still very much alive concept that the way to make change is through catastrophe and through breaking the vessels, if you will. And so in this year that we commemorated so many years after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and just this past week we laid to rest Shimon Peres, who, like Yochanan ben Zakkai, was called someone who was naive, someone who he was called wise but foolish. In fact, both Rabin and Peres died trying to do the hard work that is necessary for change. They were not naive. The fact that many in the Arab world didn't come to Peres's funeral because they recognized how strong he was in terms of defense of Israel. Rabin was a decorated war hero, obviously. These were men who understood that Israel's defense was sacrosanct, but they also understood that in order to ensure the long-term prosperity of the Jewish people, we needed to make accommodation with the reality of two peoples living on the same land. So they were doing the hard work. In the case of Rabin, he was cut down by an assassin's bullet. In the case of Shimon Peres, the clock simply ran out. 93 years he tried. It is up to us to take the message of a Rabin and of a Peres, and not necessarily the message of the right or the left today, who it seems to me are both looking for silver bullets, are both looking for the catastrophe that will show that they are correct. It's pretty obvious in terms of what the right is doing in terms of expanding settlements, that what they're trying to do is to push the facts on the ground to create a situation where they break all of the strains and constraints necessary for a Palestinian state so that it can no longer be sustainable. And so what they're trying to do is to work outside of history rather than within history. But the truth is that there are many on the left also that feel that they can kind of just sit out there with idealistic, naive, truly naive beliefs and policies that don't take into account the very real needs, concerns, and paranoia of the Jewish people and the Palestinian people who have gone through so much and have so much distrust one for the other. So both of them are kind of waiting on the side for the catastrophe to happen, when the country will wake up and understand that either on the right that the settlers have had it right all along, or for the left that they'll understand that those who have been warning about the civil war coming or the destruction of Israel's image in the world, or that there'll be another war and that Israel can't survive. Both of these sides are waiting for something catastrophic to happen to prove them right. And the truth is that people and leaders such as Peres and such as Rabin, who paid their dues and understood the very real concerns of the people of Israel and of the military of Israel, also understood in realistic ways that concessions and accommodations needed to be made. Not to say that they believed naively that there were partners out there that were ready, but they did understand that they had to continue the work as long as it might take through the boundaries and the constraints of history, of politics, of providing social services and setting an example to make that change possible. So while I was thinking of a song that we could play to end the podcast, I did read one of the eulogies for Shimon Peres, quoted the chapter in Pirkei Avot, which basically says that the work is long and the day is short, and none of us individually can complete our work, but that does not provide us with an excuse for not continuing the work every day, both our own work and that which was left for us by others. And the message here is that while Shimon Peres worked hard for 93 years, it is now our duty to continue doing the hard work within history, within the boundaries and constraints of reality, to make our future better. So with that, let's finish the blog post today with a song written by Jeff Klepper and Dan Friedlander. The name of the band in the 70s was Kol Beseder, and the song is Lo Alecha. Enjoy, and see you next time.
Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor, Lo Alecha Ligmor, Lo Alecha Hamlacha Ligmor, Lo Alecha Ligmor, Velo Ata Ben Chorin Lehibatel Mimena, Velo Ata Ben Chorin, Velo Ata